He broke my dog's neck last night in the hallway, and the silence he left behind was heavier than the dead weight in my arms. This morning he walks down the stairs, straightening his silk tie in the hallway mirror, smirking at his own reflection because he believes he has finally trained me into perfect submission. I pour his dark Colombian roast with a steady hand, placing the delicate china cup on the saucer without spilling a single drop of the steaming liquid. His arrogance shatters instantly when he turns around to see the president of the State Bar Association sitting calmly at his breakfast table. In that split second of terror, he finally understands that my silence was never surrender. It was a skillfully drafted death sentence. You know that specific kind of silence that fills a courtroom right before the verdict is read, don't you? That is the heavy air I have been breathing for the last 10 years inside this sprawling colonial mansion in the quiet suburbs. Imagine a house where the floors are always polished to a mirror shine, where the scent of lemon furniture polish masks the faint metallic tang of fear, and where every dinner party is a meticulously rehearsed performance of marital bliss. I built this golden cage myself, brick by brick, sacrificing my own bar license and my identity to be the perfect wife for a man who treats the law like a weapon. We were supposed to be partners in justice, but somewhere along the way, I became the defendant in a trial that never ends. You might look at my life from the outside and see the diamond earrings or the luxury cars, but you don't see the bruises carefully hidden under long sleeves or the way I flinch when a door slams. Last night was the end of the evidence phase. And today, my dear friends, is Judgment Day. The morning sun filters through the high windows of the kitchen, casting long and sharp shadows across the granite countertops that I spent an hour cleaning. My ribs ache with a dull and throbbing pulse every time I take a breath, a physical reminder of the lesson Thomas tried to teach me just a few hours ago. I move through the kitchen with the efficiency of a ghost, arranging the silverware with precise alignment, ensuring that the knife blade faces inward just the way he likes it. I catch my reflection in the chrome toaster, and the woman staring back at me looks like a stranger, her eyes hollowed out by exhaustion but burning with a cold and new resolve. I apply another layer of concealer over the purple mark on my cheekbone, blending the pigment into my skin until the violence is invisible to the naked eye. It is essential that I look perfect today, because a lawyer must always present an impeccable front when she steps into the arena. I am not making breakfast for a husband. I am preparing the exhibit table for the prosecution. Let me take you back to the moment the gavel fell, to the incident that finally broke the statute of limitations on my patience. It was past midnight when Thomas stumbled through the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut with a violence that shook the frames on the wall. The smell of expensive scotch and stale perfume drifted off him in waves, a toxic cloud that permeated the pristine air of the foyer. Buster, my old golden retriever and the only living thing in this house that offered me unconditional love, trotted out to greet him, his tail wagging with a naive hope that always broke my heart. Thomas stopped in the middle of the hallway, swaying slightly on his feet, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the dog as if looking at a stain on his expensive rug. The air in the house turned frigid, and I froze at the top of the stairs, my hand gripping the banister so hard that my knuckles turned white. I knew that look. I knew the simmering rage that bubbled beneath his tailored suit, and I knew that someone was going to pay for whatever courtroom failure he had suffered that day. He muttered something about the noise, about the incessant tapping of claws on the hardwood, even though Buster hadn't made a sound. I started to descend the stairs, calling out softly to distract him, to draw his fire onto me and away from the innocent animal. But I was too slow, or perhaps he was just too quick in his cruelty. He lashed out with a sudden and vicious kick, sending the poor creature skidding across the polished floor and into the wall with a sickening thud. The yelp was cut short, silenced by the impact, and the silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. I didn't scream. I couldn't scream, because the air had been punched out of my lungs by the sheer senselessness of the act. He didn't even look at me. He just adjusted his cufflink and stepped over the body, muttering that he had solved the noise problem. That was the moment the man I married died, and the defendant was born. I ran to Buster, falling to my knees on the hard floor, my hands trembling as I felt for a pulse that was no longer there. Tears blurred my vision, hot and stinging, but I refused to let a single sob escape my throat because he would hear it and enjoy it. Thomas turned back, annoyed by my display of grief, and walked over to where I was huddled over the only friend I had left. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh with bruising force, and hauled me up until my face was inches from his. He told me that I was pathetic, that I cared more for a beast than for the peace of his home, and then he shoved me backward. I stumbled, my heel catching on the rug, and I fell hard against the console table, the corner biting into my side. He stood over me, looming like a judge pronouncing a sentence, and told me to clean up the mess before morning. Then he walked up the stairs, leaving me alone with the body and the blood, confident that I would do exactly what I was told. I spent the rest of the night not in mourning, but in preparation, moving through the house like a crime scene investigator. I carried Buster out to the garden, burying him under the old oak tree by the light of the moon, whispering a promise that this would be the last casualty. When I returned inside, I didn't go to sleep. I went to his study. I knew the code to his safe, because his arrogance made him predictable. He used my birthday, marking the day he acquired me as his property. Inside were the files he thought were secure, the blackmail material, the offshore accounts, the evidence of witness tampering that he kept as insurance. I sat on the floor of the study, illuminated only by the glow of my flashlight, and I read every single page, categorizing the crimes in my mind, building the case that would destroy him. I wasn't crying anymore. I was calculating, my mind sharpening into the razor-edged instrument it used to be before he dulled it. Now, the sun is fully up, and the coffee is brewed to perfection, the aroma filling the kitchen with a deceptive warmth. I hear the floorboards creak upstairs, signaling that the master of the house is awake and expecting his service. I check the table one last time, ensuring that the 3 place settings are arranged with geometric precision. The doorbell rings, a sharp and clear sound that cuts through the morning quiet, and I walk to the door with a calm that surprises even me. I open it to reveal the guests I invited while Thomas was snoring in his drunken stupor. The president of the State Bar Association, a man of impeccable integrity who was once Thomas's mentor, stands there with a confused expression, holding the urgent message I sent him. Behind him are 2 officers from the Economic Crimes Unit, their badges glinting in the morning light. I smile, a polite and practiced smile, and invite them in for breakfast, ushering them toward the dining room just as Thomas's footsteps approach the landing. Thomas walks into the kitchen, his hair perfectly combed, his suit crisp, fully expecting to find a broken woman waiting to serve him. He stops dead in his tracks, his hand freezing on the knot of his tie, his eyes widening as they land on the people sitting at his table. The air leaves the room, sucked out by the sheer magnitude of his shock, and for the first time in 10 years, I see genuine fear in his eyes. He looks at me, searching for an explanation, searching for the submissive wife he left on the floor last night, but she is gone. I stand by the coffee pot, my spine straight, my chin held high, and I gesture to the empty chair at the head of the table. I don't say a word. I don't have to, because the dossier sitting next to the toast rack speaks volumes. The trial has begun, Thomas, and this time there will be no plea bargain. The silence in the room is so thick and heavy that the delicate clinking of the silver spoon against the china cup sounds like a judge's gavel striking the bench, signaling the beginning of a trial that Thomas never saw coming. I watch him sink into his chair, his movements stiff and mechanical, his eyes darting between the stern face of the Bar Association president and the impassive expressions of the officers, trying to calculate a defense strategy for a crime he hasn't even been charged with yet. My ribs scream in protest with every shallow breath I take, a sharp and jagged reminder of the collision with the console table just a few hours ago. But I push the physical agony down into a cold, dark place in my mind where I store all my unwept tears. It is fascinating to watch a predator shrink when he realizes he is no longer at the top of the food chain, his shoulders hunching forward as if trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear into the expensive Italian fabric of his suit. I place the coffee pot back on the warmer with a steady hand, the aroma of the dark roast mingling with the faint, sterile scent of the antiseptic I used to clean the hallway floor before dawn. You might think I am calm because I am safe now, but this composure is not peace. It is the rigid discipline of a lawyer who knows that one emotional slip could lose the entire case. I didn't sleep a single minute last night after he marched upstairs, leaving me alone in the foyer with the silence and the body of the only creature that ever loved me without condition. Instead of collapsing into the hysteria that he expected, instead of packing a bag and running into the night only to be dragged back by his threats and his connections, I went to the utility closet and retrieved the bucket and the bleach. I scrubbed the hardwood floor where Buster had landed, the rough bristles of the brush moving in a rhythmic and hypnotic circle, erasing the physical evidence of his cruelty while etching the memory of it permanently into my soul. The house was filled with the rhythmic sound of Thomas snoring from the master bedroom, a deep and rumbling noise that used to make me feel safe, but now sounded like the growling of a beast sleeping off its kill. I realized as I wrung out the blood-tinged water that leaving him would never be enough, because he would simply find another victim, another woman to break, another life to ruin with his charming smile and his violent hands. I dried the floor with a towel, my movements precise and methodical, treating my own home like a crime scene that needed to be processed, not to hide the crime, but to prepare the scene for the inevitable reconstruction. Once the hallway was pristine again, reflecting the moonlight on its polished surface, I moved to his study, a room that always smelled of stale cigar smoke and the leather of bound law books. This was his sanctuary, the place where he crafted the legal loopholes that let guilty men walk free, and it was the place where he kept the secrets that gave him power over them. I stood before the heavy steel safe hidden behind the painting of the Scales of Justice, a painting he bought, ironically, to mock the very concept he swore to uphold. I didn't need to hire a safecracker or guess a random combination, because Thomas is a narcissist who views everything in his life as property, including me. I typed in my own birthday, the numbers clicking softly in the quiet room, a chilling confirmation that he sees my existence solely as an extension of his own, a possession locked away for his convenience. The heavy door swung open with a smooth and oiled silence, revealing the stacks of ledgers and digital drives that I knew were there, the physical proof of the money laundering and the blackmail schemes he bragged about when he was drunk and thought I was too stupid to understand. I sat on the Persian rug, with the documents spread out around me like a fan, the glow of a single desk lamp illuminating the depth of his corruption. And for a moment, I wasn't his victim. I was the sharp and hungry law student I used to be. My finger traced the lines of the ledger, connecting the deposits from known criminal organizations to the shell companies he had set up in the names of his unsuspecting clients. I felt a strange and hollow ache in my chest, not for the man sleeping upstairs, but for the ghost of the man I thought I married 10 years ago, the memory of him flickering in my mind like a dying candle. I looked up at the framed photograph on his desk, a picture of us from when we were both interns, eating cheap takeout on the steps of the courthouse, sharing a single sandwich because we couldn't afford two. In that photo, his eyes were bright with idealism, and he had held my hand as if it were something precious, promising me that we would use the law to shield the innocent from the monsters of the world. I wonder, with a bitterness that tastes like bile, at what exact moment the man who wanted to save the world decided that it was more profitable to own it, and when he decided that I was just another asset to be managed and disciplined. The transition from protector to monster didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion of his soul, a gradual darkening of the waters, until the light could no longer reach the bottom. I remember the first time he compromised, the first time he took a case he knew was wrong because the payout would buy us this house, this golden cage where I am currently serving breakfast to his executioners. He told me it was for us, for our future. But I saw the way he looked at the check, with a hunger that he never directed at me, a lust for power that quickly replaced his passion for justice. Sitting there on the floor of his study, surrounded by the evidence of his moral decay, I realized that the Thomas I loved died years ago, and the creature upstairs was just a parasite wearing his face. I closed the ledger with a soft thud, the sound marking the final death of my marriage and the birth of my case, and I felt the fear evaporate, replaced by a cold and jagged determination. I wasn't just a battered wife anymore. I was the lead prosecutor, the jury, and the executioner. And I had just finished the discovery phase of the trial of the century. I spent the remaining hours before dawn, preparing the exhibits, organizing the files into neat piles, flagging the most damning pages with yellow sticky notes, just like I used to do when we worked on cases together. I went to the guest bathroom to shower, scrubbing my skin until it was red and raw, trying to wash away the feeling of his hands on me, the sensation of being owned. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't look at the bruise blooming on my cheek. I looked at my eyes, searching for the steel that used to be there, the fire that he tried to extinguish with his fists and his cruel words. I applied my makeup like war paint, concealing the damage not to hide the truth, but to control the narrative, because today I need to be the strong survivor, not the broken object of pity. I put on my old suit, the one I wore to my first trial, the fabric feeling tight across my shoulders but empowering, a suit of armor for the battle that was about to begin. I went to the kitchen and started to cook, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables and the sizzling of bacon creating a domestic symphony that masked the violence of my intentions. Now, standing here by the table, watching him tremble as he brings his coffee cup to his lips, I feel a surge of power that is almost intoxicating in its intensity. The bar president clears his throat, a dry and authoritative sound that makes Thomas flinch, and I can see the sweat beginning to bead on my husband's forehead, despite the cool air conditioning. I move to the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat that Thomas always claimed as his throne, and I pull it out with a deliberate scraping sound against the floor. I sit down, my spine straight against the wood, ignoring the sharp flare of pain in my ribs, and I place my hand on the thick file folder that sits between the butter dish and the marmalade. I don't look at the guests. I keep my eyes locked on Thomas, forcing him to meet my gaze, forcing him to see the woman he thought he had destroyed. I believe, I say softly, my voice steady and devoid of any tremor, that we have a full docket this morning, Thomas. So perhaps we should skip the pleasantries and proceed directly to the opening statements. The man sitting across from me, clutching his coffee cup like a lifeline, was once the brightest star in the legal firmament, a man who would quote Atticus Finch with tears in his eyes and believe every word of it. I slide the first document across the polished mahogany table, the paper making a dry, rasping sound that cuts through the silence, and I watch as the color drains from his face because he recognizes the date on the header. It was 5 years ago, the winter of the waterfront case, the defining moment when the noble public defender I married was murdered by his own ambition and replaced by the hollow shell sitting before us today. I remember the night he came home after the verdict, soaked to the bone from the freezing rain, his eyes burning with a humiliation so deep it terrified me, because he had lost the case to a corrupt corporate lawyer who bought the jury. He didn't yell. He just sat in the dark living room, staring at the wall, and whispered that integrity was a consolation prize for losers, a lie that poor people tell themselves to sleep at night. That was the crack in the dam, the moment the poisonous water started to seep in. And instead of patching it, I held his hand and told him it would be okay, effectively signing the death warrant for our morals. The Bar Association president picks up the document, adjusting his reading glasses with a frown, while the two officers lean in closer, their interest piqued by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Thomas tries to reach for the paper, his hand trembling, but I fix him with a look so cold it freezes him in place, a look that reminds him that his authority in this house ended the moment he raised his hand against me. After that lost case, the changes were subtle at first, masked as practical decisions for our financial security. But looking back, I see them as the bricks he used to build my prison. He demanded I quit my job at the firm, insisting that it looked bad for his wife to work for the competition, claiming he wanted to take care of me, to give me the life of leisure I deserved. It sounded like love, didn't it? But it was actually a strategic disarmament, stripping me of my income, my professional network, and my independence until I had to ask him for cash to buy feminine products. I became an allowance wife, a woman who had to produce receipts for every grocery trip, while he bought $1,000 suits to armor himself against a world he no longer trusted. I turned the page of the dossier, revealing a photocopy of a bank statement from the Cayman Islands, and the sound of Thomas's sharp intake of breath is the only confirmation the officers need. This brings us to the first compromise. The first time he tasted the forbidden fruit of corruption and found it sweet, and the first time he realized that violence was an effective tool for silence. It was 3 years ago, the cartel defense, when he came home with a shoebox wrapped in brown paper, shoving it into the back of the closet behind his winter coats. I found it when I was organizing his wardrobe, the stacks of $100 bills smelling of mold and gasoline, and when I confronted him, asking if this was blood money, he didn't explain, he didn't apologize. He slapped me. a sharp and stinging blow across the face that sent me reeling into the closet door, the shock of it hurting far more than the physical pain. It was the first time he had ever touched me in anger, and he stood there, looking at his own hand with a mix of horror and fascination, realizing that he had crossed a line and the sky hadn't fallen. He apologized that night, of course, weeping on his knees and blaming the stress, blaming the clients, blaming the alcohol. And like a fool, I forgave him because I thought it was an aberration, a glitch in the programming of a good man. But as I look at him now, shrinking under the scrutiny of his mentor, I realize that my forgiveness was the fuel that kept his engine of destruction running for all these years. By staying silent, by hiding the bruise with makeup and the money with creative accounting, I taught him that there were no consequences for his actions, that he could sell his soul and beat his wife and still wake up to a hot breakfast. The shame washes over me, hot and prickly. Not for what he did, but for what I allowed, for the comfortable lie I lived while he turned into a monster. I was his accomplice, an accessory to the crime of my own abuse, and today is as much about my penance as it is about his punishment. I slide another photo onto the table, a picture of a bruised witness from a case he settled out of court, and I see the president's jaw tighten in disgust. Thomas finally finds his voice, a cracked and desperate sound, trying to weave a narrative of entrapment, claiming that these documents are forged, that I am a hysterical woman off her medication. She's been under a lot of stress, he stammers, looking at the officers with a pleading grin. We lost a pet recently. She's not thinking clearly. I don't interrupt him. I let him dig his own grave with his lies, because every word he speaks contradicts the hard evidence spreading across the tablecloth like a stain. I reach for the final piece of this specific puzzle, the ledger that details not just the money, but the leverage he held over judges and politicians, the dirty secrets he collected to ensure he never lost another case. This is the God complex in black and white, the proof that he believed he was above the law, above morality, and certainly above his wife. I push it toward the officers, my finger resting on a highlighted name, and say, "You might want to look at page 40. Gentlemen, it explains why the district attorney dropped the charges against his client last month." The silence that follows is absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a natural disaster, as the men at the table realize the scope of what sits before them. Thomas stops talking mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open, his eyes locked on the ledger that he thought was buried deep in the steel belly of his safe. He looks at me, really looks at me, and for the first time, he sees the wreckage he caused, not just to my body, but to the shared dream we once had. He starts to stand up, his chair scraping violently against the floor, a flash of the old aggression flaring in his eyes. But the officer on the left places a heavy hand on his shoulder, pushing him back down. "Sit down, counselor," the officer says, his voice low and dangerous. "We are not done with breakfast yet." I pick up my coffee cup, taking a slow sip, the bitter liquid grounding me, and I prepare to peel back the next layer of his life, to show them exactly what happens when the lights go out in this perfect house. The officer's hand remains heavy and unyielding on Thomas's shoulder, a physical weight that mirrors the crushing burden of truth I am about to place on this table. The Bar Association president looks at me, his face pale and his lips drawn into a tight line of anticipation, waiting for the testimony that will connect the white-collar corruption in those ledgers to the bruised woman sitting before him. I take a slow and deliberate breath, wincing as my cracked rib presses against my lung, and I let the pain sharpen my focus, transporting me back to the exact moment the clock struck midnight and the front door opened. You need to understand that the violence didn't start with a shout or a raised fist. It started with the terrifying casualness of a man who believes he owns the world and everything living in it. Buster was sleeping by the radiator, his golden fur rising and falling in a rhythm of pure peace, until the latch clicked and he scrambled up, his tail wagging with that boundless and foolish loyalty that dogs possess. I was coming down the stairs, a glass of water in my hand, and I saw Thomas standing there, swaying slightly, his eyes glazed over with the specific kind of malice that comes from a day of winning cases for guilty men. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on the dog dancing around his legs, and I saw the irritation flicker across his face like a match being struck in a dark room. It happened so fast that my mind struggled to process the sequence of events, filtering the horror through a lens of disbelief that shattered the moment his foot moved. He didn't just kick the dog aside to clear a path. He pulled his leg back and delivered a calculated and vicious blow to the animal's neck, a strike meant to inflict maximum damage with minimum effort. The sound was not a yelp. It was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage, followed by a silence that was louder than any scream I have ever heard in my life. Buster slid across the polished hardwood floor like a discarded rag doll, hitting the baseboard with a dull thud. And then he didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just lay there with his eyes open and glassy. I dropped the glass of water, the crystal shattering on the stairs and sending shards raining down around my bare feet. But I didn't feel the cuts because my heart had stopped beating in my chest. Thomas just stood there, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, looking down at the lifeless body of my best friend with an expression of mild annoyance, as if he had just stepped in a puddle rather than taken a life. "He was always too loud," Thomas muttered, his voice slurring slightly, "always getting under my feet when I'm trying to think." I flew down the remaining stairs, ignoring the glass slicing into my soles, and fell to my knees beside Buster, my hands frantically searching for a heartbeat that I knew was gone. The fur was still warm, soft under my trembling fingers, but the spark was extinguished, snuffed out by the man who had once promised to protect all living things. I looked up at him through a blur of tears, trying to find the man I married, trying to find a shred of remorse or shock, but all I saw was a cold and empty vessel. "You killed him," I whispered, the words scraping against my throat like sandpaper. "Thomas, you killed him." He looked at me with a sneer, leaning down until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath, and laughed a dry, humorless sound. "Don't use that prosecutor tone with me, Diana," he spat. "It was an accident. The stupid beast tripped me. And if you know what's good for you, you'll write it up as a household mishap." He was already rewriting the narrative, already building his defense, treating the murder of my dog as a minor inconvenience that needed to be filed away and forgotten. I stood up then, shaking with a rage that I hadn't felt in years, a righteous anger that momentarily eclipsed my fear of him. "This isn't a mishap. This is animal cruelty. This is a felony," I said, my voice rising, my lawyer's instinct kicking in as I cited the statutes I used to memorize. "You are going to bury him properly, and you are going to acknowledge what you did." That was the wrong thing to say, because for a narcissist like Thomas, being held accountable is the ultimate insult, a direct challenge to his God complex. His face darkened, the veins in his neck bulging as he stepped closer, invading my personal space until I was pressed against the wall. "You think you're still a lawyer?" he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "You're nothing, Diana. You're a housewife who lives on my charity, a failed attorney who couldn't cut it in the real world." He was stripping me of my identity, dismantling my professional pride brick by brick, trying to reduce me to something small and pathetic that he could crush under his heel, just like he did the dog. "I am the law in this house," he roared, "and the law says you shut your mouth." Then came the physical blow, not with a fist, but with the heavy leather briefcase he was still holding in his left hand, a weapon of his trade turned against his wife. He swung it with a terrifying speed, the hard corner of the case catching me in the ribs with a force that knocked the wind out of me and sent white stars exploding behind my eyelids. I crumbled to the floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come, the pain radiating through my chest like fire, paralyzing my limbs. He didn't stop there. He grabbed a handful of my hair, yanking my head back so I was forced to look up at him, forced to witness his absolute dominance. "Look at you," he hissed. "Look at this mess you've made. Broken glass, and a dead dog and a crying woman." He wasn't hitting me because he lost control. He was hitting me to establish order, to put the unruly elements of his life back in their assigned places. I lay there on the cold wood, tasting copper and bile, realizing that to him, I was no different than the dog, just another creature that needed to be disciplined into silence. The most chilling part, the part that kept me awake all night and led me to open that safe, was what happened next. He didn't apologize. He didn't panic. He didn't try to help me up or check if he had broken my bones. He simply released my hair, letting my head drop back against the floor, and stepped over my curled-up body as if I were a piece of furniture that had fallen over. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself another glass of water, and then started up the stairs, pausing only halfway to look back down at the carnage in the foyer. "Clean this up before I wake up," he said, his voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. "I have a big meeting tomorrow, and I don't want to see any of this garbage in the morning." Then he went to our bedroom, and 5 minutes later, the lights went out, and he was asleep. He slept the sleep of the just, leaving me alone with the corpse of my dog and the shattered remains of my life. And that was the moment I knew that the man upstairs wasn't just abusive, he was a sociopath who had finally taken off his mask. I look up from the table now, my eyes dry and burning, and I see the horror reflected in the faces of the men sitting opposite me. I slowly unbutton the cuff of my blazer, rolling up the sleeve to reveal the deep, purple bruising that wraps around my wrist where he grabbed me to pull me up, and I can feel the shift in the room's energy. Thomas is shaking his head frantically, his composure crumbling like wet sand. "She's lying," he stammers, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She tripped on the stairs. She's clumsy. I tried to catch her." The lie hangs in the air, grotesque and obvious, contrasting sharply with the meticulous evidence I have laid out. I look at the bar president, whose face has turned a shade of gray I have never seen before, and I speak with the quiet authority of a judge delivering a sentence. "The bruising on my ribs matches the corner of your briefcase, Thomas, which is currently sitting by the door with my blood trace likely still on the leather," I say softly. "Would you like the officers to bag it as Exhibit B, or shall we continue with the financial records?" The silence that follows is broken only by the sound of Thomas's breathing, which has become ragged and shallow, the sound of a trapped animal realizing there is no way out of the cage. He looks at the briefcase by the door, then back at me, and I see the realization dawn on him that I didn't just clean the house last night, I preserved the crime scene in my mind and on my body. The officer on his right shifts, his hand moving instinctively toward the handcuffs at his belt, but he waits for the final nail in the coffin. I reach for the last document in the stack, the one that ties the violence to the money, the proof that his rage wasn't just domestic, it was a symptom of a life spiraling out of control due to gambling debts and blackmail. "He didn't just hit me because he was angry," I tell the witnesses. "He hit me because I found this." And I slide the paper across the table, watching as Thomas's last hope evaporates into the morning air. The timeline of justice is rarely a straight line. It is a circle that closes tight around the throat of the guilty. And to understand the finality of this moment, you must go back to the darkest hour before the dawn. At 4 a.m, while Thomas was deep in his alcohol-induced slumber upstairs, dreaming of his own invincibility, I was standing in the harsh, fluorescent light of the guest bathroom, staring at the woman in the mirror. I opened the hidden compartment behind the vanity mirror, the one where I kept my emergency cash and the open-ended plane ticket to Seattle that I had purchased 3 years ago as a desperate fantasy of escape. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of decision, because for years I believed that freedom meant running away, meant disappearing into the fog where he couldn't find me. I looked at that ticket, at the promise of a new life in a rainy city where nobody knew my name, and then I looked at the purple bruise blooming across my ribcage like a dark flower. I realized that if I ran, I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, always the victim, always the hunted, and he would simply find another woman to torment. I took the ticket, the paper feeling cool and smooth against my fingertips, and I tore it slowly down the middle, the sound of the ripping paper echoing like a gunshot in the silent tiled room. I dropped the pieces into the trash can, covering them with a tissue, and applied a layer of foundation to my face, not to hide the truth, but to armor myself for the war I had chosen to fight right here in this kitchen. Once the decision to stand my ground was made, the trembling in my hands ceased completely, replaced by the cold and clinical efficiency that made me top of my class in law school. I went down to the kitchen, the only light coming from the open refrigerator door, and I retrieved my burner phone, the one Thomas didn't know existed. The first call was the hardest because it required me to shatter the illusion of the perfect marriage I had maintained for a decade, exposing my shame to the man who had walked me down the aisle when my own father couldn't make it. I dialed the private number of Arthur, the Bar Association president, knowing he would be awake because he is an insomniac who reads case files at dawn. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep and confusion, asking why I was calling at such an ungodly hour. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for help. I simply told him that I had the ledger from the waterfront case and the proof of the judicial bribery scheme he had suspected for years. I told him that if he wanted to save the integrity of the profession he loved, he needed to be at my breakfast table at 7 sharp, and he needed to bring his moral compass because he was going to need it. He asked me if I was safe, and I looked at the knife block on the counter, realizing that for the first time in forever, I was the one holding the blade. "I am not safe, Arthur," I whispered into the phone, "but I am finally dangerous." The second call was to Detective Miller, a man who had asked me out on a date 15 years ago, a man I rejected for the charismatic Thomas, but who had remained a distant and watchful friend in the Economic Crimes Unit. I knew Miller had been trying to pin a RICO charge on Thomas's associates for months, but he lacked the internal documentation to make the charges stick without a subpoena. I sat on the cold kitchen stool, wrapping my cardigan tighter around my bruised ribs, and dialed his number, knowing that this call was the point of no return, the moment I officially became a snitch against my own husband. Miller picked up immediately, alert and professional, and I skipped the pleasantries, giving him the specific account numbers and the location of the physical evidence sitting in the safe. I told him that I was hosting a breakfast that he couldn't afford to miss, and that he should bring a warrant and a pair of handcuffs. But no sirens, because I wanted this to be a civilized execution. He was silent for a long moment, processing the betrayal and the gift I was handing him. And then he simply asked if the door would be unlocked. "The door will be open," I said, my voice steady. "And the coffee will be hot. Just make sure you don't let him talk his way out of it." The third call was the only one that threatened to break my composure, the only one where the mask of the prosecutor slipped to reveal the grieving daughter. I called my mother, the woman who had warned me about Thomas's temper years ago, the woman whose advice I had ignored in the blindness of love. When she answered, her voice filled with that instinctual maternal panic, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back because I had a job to do. I didn't tell her about the bruises or the money laundering. I told her about Buster, because I knew she loved that dog almost as much as I did. "He killed Buster." "Mom," I said, the words heavy and final, "and I need you to come later this morning to take his body, because I won't let Thomas throw him in the trash like garbage." She started to scream, to demand that I leave the house immediately, but I cut her off with a gentleness that surprised me. "I'm not leaving, Mom. I'm finishing this," I told her. "Just come for Buster, and bring a shovel, because we are going to bury him under the oak tree where he liked to sleep." I hung up the phone before she could argue, placing the device on the counter, and watched the sun begin to bleed through the curtains, signaling the start of the end. Now, we are back in the present, the morning light fully illuminating the kitchen where Thomas sits trapped between his crimes and his consequences. He stares at me, his mind racing to catch up, and he realizes that the calm woman serving him toast is not the same woman he struck down last night. I can see the dawn of understanding in his eyes, the realization that while he was sleeping off his rage, I was dismantling his life with 3 simple phone conversations. The bar president looks at the ledger, Detective Miller looks at the bruising on my wrist, and Thomas looks at the phone sitting on the counter, the black plastic device that turned out to be more lethal than his fists. "You planned this," he whispers, his voice barely audible. "You set me up while I was sleeping." I pour myself another cup of coffee, the steam rising in the quiet air, and I look him dead in the eye. "I didn't set you up, Thomas," I reply. "I just finally decided to represent myself. There is something truly grotesque about watching a man eat a gourmet meal while his life is burning down around him. But Thomas has always believed that his appetite is more important than anyone else's reality. He picks up his silver knife and fork, the utensils glinting under the chandelier light, and he slices into the medium-rare steak I prepared, the red juice pooling on the white porcelain plate like a fresh wound. He takes a bite, chewing slowly and deliberately, looking at the Bar Association president with a smirk that suggests this entire gathering is nothing more than a tedious misunderstanding that he will clear up over coffee. You might expect him to be trembling, to be begging for mercy now that the cards are on the table, but you are underestimating the sheer, blinding power of a narcissist's ego. He swallows the meat, dabs his mouth with the linen napkin, and leans back in his chair, treating the police officers in his dining room as if they were uninvited pest control workers. "This is excellent steak, Diana," he says, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that makes my skin crawl. "It is a shame that your cooking has improved, just as your mental faculties have obviously declined." He ignores the ledger sitting open on the table. He ignores the bruising on my wrist, and instead, he launches into the defense strategy he has used against me for years: the total invalidation of my sanity. He turns his charm on Arthur, the older man who used to mentor him, offering a conspiratorial smile that implies they are just two reasonable men dealing with a hysterical woman. "You know how it is, Arthur," Thomas says, waving his hand dismissively toward me as if I am a piece of furniture. "Diana has been struggling with depression since she left the firm, and she creates these elaborate fantasies to feel important again." He speaks about me in the third person, erasing my presence, trying to rewrite history in real time to paint himself as the long-suffering husband of a mentally unstable wife. "The dog ran away, Arthur, and she couldn't handle the grief, so she invented this story about me kicking it, and then she forged these financial documents to punish me." He says it with such conviction, with such a smooth and practiced delivery, that for a split second, I can feel the air in the room shift, the gravitational pull of his charisma trying to bend the truth. I sit perfectly still, my hands folded on my lap, watching him weave his web of lies, and I realize that he actually believes his own fiction, because in his world, he is incapable of error. He looks at Detective Miller, his eyes narrowing slightly, shifting tactics from charm to intimidation, playing the card of his social status and his political connections. "And you, detective," Thomas sneers, picking up his coffee cup, "I hope you have a very solid warrant, because dragging a man of my standing out of his own home on the word of a vindictive housewife is a career-ending move." He is threatening them, reminding them of the judges he plays golf with, the senators he invites to dinner, the intricate network of power that has protected him for a decade. He honestly thinks that the badge on the detective's chest is less powerful than the monogram on his own shirt cuff, and that the law is something that applies to other people, not to Thomas the Great. "I suggest you take these ridiculous files, apologize for the intrusion, and let my wife and I sort out our domestic issues in private," he commands, as if he is concluding a meeting in his boardroom. But the silence that meets his command is not the silence of compliance. It is the silence of men who are looking at a monster and wondering how they never saw the scales before. Arthur doesn't smile back. He doesn't nod in agreement. He just looks at the steak knife in Thomas's hand and then at the bruise on my arm, connecting the dots of violence. Thomas senses that his charm is failing, that the old magic tricks aren't working on this audience, and I see the panic flare behind his eyes, hot and dangerous. He drops the facade of the gentleman, the veneer of civility cracking to reveal the ugly, snarling creature that lives beneath the expensive suit. He turns his gaze on me, and the hatred in his eyes is so pure and unfiltered that it feels like a physical blow, a scorching heat that tries to wither me right in my chair. "This is what this is about, isn't it?" he hisses, his voice dropping to a venomous growl. "You are jealous, Diana. You have always been jealous that I succeeded where you failed, that I became a partner while you became a nobody." He stands up then, knocking his chair back, his hands slamming down on the table with a force that makes the silverware jump, forgetting the police, forgetting the witness, focused only on destroying me. "I made you!" he screams, his face contorted and red, spit flying from his lips. "I gave you this house! I gave you these clothes! I gave you a life you didn't earn!" He is trying to make me feel small, trying to shrink me back into the submissive role he crafted for me, using his volume and his rage to assert dominance one last time. "You are nothing without me, Diana, just a washed-up lawyer playing detective, and when I walk out of here, I will make sure you never have a dime to your name." It is a terrifying display, a crescendo of arrogance. But as I look at him, I don't feel the fear he wants me to feel. I only feel a profound sense of pity. He thinks he is a giant, but he is just a small man standing in the ruins of his own ego, screaming at a woman who has already signed his death warrant. I pick up my napkin, dab the corner of my mouth, and look at Detective Miller, giving him the signal that the show is over and the curtain is ready to fall. Thomas is still ranting, listing my failures, listing his achievements, completely unaware that he has just confessed to the motive of financial control and emotional abuse in front of 3 witnesses. He grabs the steak knife, not to use it, but to point it at me for emphasis, a final gesture of threat that seals his fate. "Put the knife down, Thomas," I say, my voice cutting through his shouting like a razor blade, calm and cold and absolute. "You are not the plaintiff anymore, and you certainly are not the judge. So sit down and let the officers do their job." He freezes, the knife hovering in the air, and for the first time, he looks around the room and sees the handcuffs coming off the detective's belt, realizing that his dinner party has officially become an arrest. The sound of the steak knife clattering onto the fine china plate is not a result of Thomas surrendering, but rather the result of Detective Miller's hand clamping down on his wrist with the crushing force of a vice. The violence in the room shifts in a split second, moving from the psychological terror Thomas inflicted to the swift and efficient physical control of the law, as the officers swarm him like white blood cells attacking an infection. He is spun around before he can even utter a protest, his face pressed hard against the very wall he used to hang his awards on, the expensive plaster cooling his flushed skin. I watch from my seat, sipping my coffee with a trembling hand, as the metallic rasp of the handcuffs ratchets shut, a sound that signals the permanent end of his reign as the king of this castle. He is shouting about his rights, about the Fourth Amendment, about how he will sue every single person in this room for wrongful arrest. But his voice sounds thin and pathetic against the backdrop of his own downfall. The Bar Association president stands up slowly, adjusting his glasses with a look of profound disappointment, and turns his back on his former protégé, a gesture that hurts Thomas more than the steel biting into his wrists. I don't feel triumph. I feel a heavy and exhausting relief, like setting down a backpack full of stones that I have been carrying for 10 years without rest. Thomas is still struggling, kicking his legs like a petulant child, trying to twist his body to look at me, his eyes wide with the shock of a man who has never been told no in his entire adult life. "Diana, tell them to stop," he screams, sweat dripping down his temple, ruining the perfect collar of his shirt. "Tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them we can fix this." I look at him, at the desperation etched into his features, and I remember the way he looked at me last night when I was on the floor, the cold indifference in his eyes when I begged him to stop hurting me. I stand up slowly, wincing as the movement pulls at my bruised ribs, and I walk over to where the officers are holding him, stopping just outside of his reach. "I can't fix this, Thomas," I say softly, my voice barely rising above a whisper. "Because you broke it beyond repair when you decided that your anger was more important than our lives." He opens his mouth to argue, to unleash another torrent of abuse, but the front door opens with a soft creak, letting in a draft of fresh morning air and the sound of birdsong that feels strangely out of place. The figure standing in the doorway is small and weathered, wearing a heavy gardening coat and holding a rusted spade in one hand and a soft wool blanket in the other. It is my mother, the woman Thomas always mocked for being too sentimental, standing there with the quiet dignity of a grieving matriarch who has come to clean up the mess her daughter couldn't prevent. She doesn't look at the police officers, she doesn't look at the broken furniture or the half-eaten breakfast. Her eyes go straight to Thomas, who is now bent over the dining chair in handcuffs. For a moment, the room is suspended in a fragile silence, the kind of silence that happens when the sacred crashes into the profane. Thomas sees her, and his face crumples, a flicker of hope igniting in his delusional mind that perhaps family loyalty will save him where the law has failed. "Mom," he chokes out, using the title he never earned. "Mom, please, tell them I'm a good man. Tell them I take care of Diana." It is a pathetic appeal to the woman he isolated me from, a last-ditch effort to manipulate the grandmother of the dog he murdered just hours ago. My mother steps into the room, her boots leaving faint traces of garden soil on the pristine floor that Thomas was so obsessed with keeping clean. She walks past him as if he were nothing more than a ghost, a transparent entity that no longer occupies space in our reality. She stops in front of me, her eyes scanning my face, noting the heavy makeup covering the bruise and the stiff way I am holding my body. She doesn't say "I told you so." She doesn't scold me for staying too long. She simply reaches out and touches my cheek with a rough, warm hand. "I'm here for Buster," she says, her voice steady and stripped of any drama. And I'm here to make sure you don't have to bury him alone." She turns then, looking back at Thomas with a gaze so cold it could freeze the blood in his veins, and she lifts the shovel slightly, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the dirty work that needs to be done. "You aren't a good man, Thomas," she says, delivering the verdict that the judge will later confirm. "You are just a small, sad bully who finally picked a fight he couldn't win." The officers hoist Thomas up, dragging him toward the door, his expensive Italian loafers dragging uselessly across the floorboards as he realizes that his audience has left the theater. He passes my mother, passes me, and passes the spot in the hallway where he took a life, and for the first time, he is completely silent, the weight of his shame finally silencing his ego. I watch him go, watch the red and blue lights of the cruiser flashing through the sheer curtains, painting the dining room in the colors of an emergency. My mother unfolds the wool blanket, the same one Buster used to sleep on when he was a puppy, and she looks toward the garden door. "Let's go," she says softly. "He's waiting for us." I nod, tears finally spilling over my lashes. Not for the husband I just sent to prison, but for the relief of having a mother who brought a shovel instead of a lecture. We walk out into the sunlight, leaving the empty house and the cold breakfast behind, walking toward the oak tree to perform the final act of this tragedy. The earth under the old oak tree is hard and unforgiving, much like the last 10 years of my marriage have been. I thrust the rusted spade into the soil, the impact jarring my bruised ribs. But I welcome the physical pain because it distracts me from the hollow ache in my chest. My mother stands beside me, her silence offering a sturdy support, while Arthur watches from the patio, his pristine leather shoes stopping at the edge of the grass, as if afraid to be contaminated by our domestic tragedy. I am still wearing my court suit, the navy blazer now smeared with clay and grass stains, a visual representation of how messy justice actually is when you have to serve it yourself. I dig with a rhythm that borders on manic, tearing at the roots that try to stop me, determined to create a resting place that is deep and safe, a place where no anger can ever reach my boy again. Sweat drips down my nose, mixing with the tears I refuse to shed in front of Thomas, and I realize that this is the first honest labor I have performed in this house. When the hole is finally deep enough, smelling of damp earth and finality, my mother steps forward with the wool blanket bundled in her arms. She lowers Buster into the ground with the tenderness of a midwife, arranging the fabric around him so he looks like he is merely sleeping through a cold winter night. I drop to my knees, ignoring the sharp stones digging into my skin, and I place his leather collar on top of the blanket, the metal tag catching the sun one last time. It feels like I am burying the only witness who truly knew the extent of my suffering, the only soul who didn't judge me for staying too long in a house that had become a war zone. My mother places a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm and grounding, and she whispers a prayer that is lost to the wind, a prayer for peace that I am not sure I deserve yet. We begin to fill the grave, the sound of dirt hitting the wool sounding like a drumbeat, marking the end of the innocence I tried so desperately to protect. Arthur finally steps onto the grass, his hesitation replaced by a solemn duty, and he stands over me as I pat the final mound of earth into place. He looks old, suddenly, the weight of the morning's revelations carving deep lines into his face, realizing that he unknowingly mentored a monster. "I will have to convene an emergency ethics hearing," he says softly, his voice devoid of its usual courtroom boom, "and I will have to recommend immediate disbarment based on the files you provided." He looks at me, waiting for me to plead for leniency, waiting for the wife to emerge and ask for mercy for her husband. But that wife is buried under the oak tree too. I wipe the dirt from my hands onto my skirt, standing up to meet his gaze, and I see the question burning in his eyes, the question of why I waited so long to burn it all down. "He didn't just break the law, Arthur," I tell him, my voice steady as a rock. "He broke the covenant of trust that makes the law work, and he used his knowledge of the system to enslave me." I reach into my pocket and pull out Thomas's Bar Association pin, the gold lapel pin he wore like a badge of nobility, which I swiped from his dresser before the police arrived. I hand it to Arthur, the small metal object feeling heavy and cold in my palm, a symbol of the prestige Thomas valued more than his own humanity. "Take this," I say, pressing it into his reluctant hand. "Tell the board that he traded his honor for control, and tell them that his wife was the only judge he couldn't bribe." Arthur closes his fingers around the pin, nodding slowly, a silent acknowledgement that justice has been served, not by a gavel, but by a shovel and a grieving woman. He turns to leave, walking back toward the house that is now a crime scene, leaving me in the garden with the fresh grave and the open sky. I look down at my dirty hands, at the soil under my fingernails, and for the first time in a decade, I feel completely clean. The silence that greets me when I step back into the house is profound, differing entirely from the oppressive quiet that used to suffocate me when Thomas was home. My mother walks in behind me, wiping her boots on the mat with a practical vigor. But I pause in the foyer, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the settling of the foundation. For 10 years, this house was a stage where I performed the role of the perfect wife, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering the director's wrath. But now the stage is empty, and the lights have been turned up to reveal the dust. I walk into the dining room, where the remains of the morning's drama are scattered across the table, the cold steak congealing on the porcelain and the half-drunk coffee leaving rings on the tablecloth. A few hours ago, this sight would have sent me into a panic, a frantic race to clean up before he could criticize my housekeeping. But now I look at the mess with a detachment that feels like a superpower. I pick up Thomas's plate, the one with the meat he cut with such aggression, and I don't feel fear. I only feel a mild disgust at the waste of good food. I walk to the kitchen and scrape the expensive beef into the trash can, the sound of the food hitting the plastic liner, signaling the end of his consumption of my energy. My mother starts to help, reaching for the glasses, but I stop her with a gentle hand on her arm, shaking my head slowly. "No, Mom," I say, my voice steady in the quiet room. "I need to do this myself. I need to clear him out of here with my own hands." I move through the kitchen with a deliberate slowness, washing the dishes not to please him, but to reclaim the objects for my own use. The soap suds feel warm and cleansing against my skin, washing away the invisible residue of his presence, and as I dry the crystal glasses, I place them back in the cabinet in a new arrangement. I am not just cleaning a room, I am exorcising a ghost, scrubbing away the memory of his demands and his insults until the granite countertops shine with a neutral brilliance. When the kitchen is spotless, I make my way upstairs, my hand gliding over the banister where I once gripped so tightly in terror. The master bedroom door is open, revealing the sanctuary where he slept, the sleep of the just while I lay awake counting my heartbeats. The smell of his cologne, a heavy musk that used to signal danger, still hangs faintly in the air, clinging to the curtains and the bedding like a stubborn stain. I walk to the closet, the walk-in space that is larger than my first apartment, and I look at the rows of his suits, color-coordinated and hung with military precision. They look like hollow skins shed by a reptile, empty and lifeless, without the man who used them to project his power. I reach into the back of the closet and pull out a box of heavy-duty black trash bags, the kind usually reserved for yard waste, and I snap one open with a sharp flick of my wrist. I start with the shoes, the Italian leather loafers, and the polished Oxfords that he used to kick open doors and intimidate witnesses. I throw them into the bag one by one, the heavy thud satisfying a deep and primitive need for retribution that I didn't know I possessed. I don't fold his shirts or carefully pack his trousers. I grab them in armfuls, hangers and all, and shove them into the darkness of the plastic sacks. My mother appears in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a look of quiet approval, watching as I dismantle the wardrobe of the man who tried to erase her daughter. "You know," she says softly, "the shelter downtown is always looking for professional clothing for men trying to get back on their feet." I pause, holding a silk tie that costs more than my mother makes in a week, and I consider the irony of Thomas's vanity being used to help the very people he despised. "That's a good idea," I reply, tossing the tie onto the pile. "Let his ego finally serve a purpose that actually benefits society." We work in silence for an hour, stripping the room of his existence, until the closet is half empty and the floor is piled high with black bags that look like body bags for a dead marriage. When the physical labor is done, I go into the bathroom, the place where I made the decision to fight back just a few hours ago. I turn on the shower, letting the steam fill the room, and I strip off the ruined suit, the navy fabric stiff with the dirt from Buster's grave. I step under the spray, the hot water hitting my skin like a benediction, stinging the cuts on my hands and the bruise on my ribs. I watch the water swirl down the drain, dark with soil and sweat, carrying away the last physical traces of the day's violence. I lather my hair, scrubbing the scalp where he grabbed me, reclaiming my body inch by inch, washing away the sensation of being property. I step out and wrap myself in a towel, wiping the steam from the mirror to look at my reflection. Really look at it, for the first time in years. The bruise on my cheek is darkening, turning a sickly shade of yellow and purple, but the eyes looking back at me are clear and fierce. I am no longer the frightened animal hiding in the corner. I am the hunter who set a trap and caught the wolf. I apply a soothing balm to my ribs, touching the skin with tenderness, promising myself that this is the last injury I will ever have to nurse in secret. I dress in comfortable clothes, a pair of soft jeans, and a sweater that Thomas hated because he said it made me look common. I walk downstairs to find my mother making tea in the kitchen, the kettle whistling a cheerful tune that sounds like a fanfare for my freedom. We sit at the small breakfast nook, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, and for the first time, I don't feel the urge to close the blinds to hide from the neighbors. "What will you do now?" my mother asks, blowing on her tea, her eyes scanning the large, empty house that suddenly feels too big for one person. "I don't know," I admit, looking out at the garden where the fresh earth marks Buster's resting place, "but I know that I'm not leaving. This house was his prison for me, but I have the keys now, and I intend to turn it into a fortress of my own making. I'm going to change the locks," I say, the thought occurring to me with a sudden clarity. "And then I'm going to paint the hallway a different color, something bright that doesn't look like a courtroom." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway makes us both jump, old reflexes dying hard, but it is not a police cruiser or a returning husband. It is a locksmith van, the one I called immediately after the police left, a service I ordered to ensure that even if he makes bail, he will never step foot in this sanctuary again. I go to the door to greet the technician, a young man with a tool belt who looks at my bruised face with a polite indifference that I appreciate. "I need every lock changed," I tell him, leading him through the house, front door, back door, garage, everything. He nods and sets to work, the sound of his drill grinding against the metal sounding like music to my ears, the sound of security being installed. I stand in the hallway while he works, running my hand over the spot on the wall where Thomas threw the vase last year, and I realize that the memories will always be here. But they are just memories now. Powerless ghosts that cannot hurt me unless I let them, and I have no intention of living in a haunted house. As the locksmith finishes the front door, handing me a set of shiny new keys that feel heavy and substantial in my hand, the landline phone begins to ring. It sits on the console table, a device that used to be an instrument of control, a way for Thomas to check up on me every hour. I stare at it for a moment, letting it ring, debating whether to answer or to unplug it and throw it in the trash with his shoes. But curiosity, or perhaps instinct, drives me to pick it up, to answer the call in my own house on my own terms. "Hello," I say, my voice strong and unwavering, no longer the timid whisper of a wife afraid of interrupting her husband's important business. "Is this Diana?" a voice asks, a voice I recognize from a lifetime ago, deep and gravelly and kind. It is the public defender from the county office, the man who hired Thomas fresh out of law school, the man Thomas betrayed when he sold out for money. "Yes, this is Diana," I reply, leaning against the wall, feeling the cool plaster against my back. "I heard about what happened," he says, his tone respectful and cautious. "Arthur called me, told me you were the one who brought the evidence." I close my eyes, a wave of emotion washing over me, realizing that the news of my actions has already traveled through the legal community. "I did what I had to do," I say simply, not wanting praise, just wanting acknowledgement of the truth. "We have an opening, Diana," he continues, his voice shifting to a professional pitch. "It's not glamorous, and the pay is terrible compared to what you're used to, but we need someone who knows how to fight for the people who can't fight for themselves." My heart skips a beat, a sudden flutter of excitement that I haven't felt since the day I passed the bar exam. I look at the new keys in my hand, at the open front door where the sunlight is pouring in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "I'm a little rusty," I say, a smile touching my lips for the first time in what feels like a century. "We don't need polish. We need steel," he counters, "and from what I hear, you have plenty of that." I look at my mother, who is watching me from the kitchen doorway, her face wreathed in a proud smile, and I look out at the oak tree standing sentinel in the yard. I think of the women who are currently sitting in houses just like this one, terrified and alone, waiting for a savior who might never come. I'll take it, I say, my voice ringing out with a conviction that surprises even me. I'll take the job. I hang up the phone and turn to the open door, stepping out onto the porch to breathe in the air that tastes of damp earth and possibility. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, but for the first time, I am not afraid of the dark. I am Diana. I am a prosecutor, and my first case was a complete victory.